Welcome, everybody. We have an incredible guest joining us today, and I'm going to introduce him to you in just a moment. But first, I want to stop and share a word from our sponsors. The Pressing the Limits podcast is brought to you by ZionMissionaryChurch.net, where you can listen, watch messages, you can share prayer requests, or even find out how to plan a visit. And also by NeuroPowerSource.com. These are resources for your mind, your body, and your spirit. You're going to find all the recommended gear that I use, including the Be Strong bands, the Juve system, and the Iron Neck. You'll be sure to want to check it out. Our guest today is Rick Collins, and he is a renowned attorney with an active national law practice focusing on clients in the bodybuilding, fitness, and dietary supplement communities. Rick Collins is the country's foremost legal authority in the area of performance-enhancing drugs, supplements, having defended cases involving steroids, human growth hormone, peptides, and other anabolic substances from coast to coast. His firm is the most well-known legal team in the sports nutrition field and assists clients worldwide on regulatory and legal issues related to dietary supplements and natural products. In addition to his longtime work as a lawyer, Rick is a popular author, fitness authority, actor, former competitive bodybuilder, and fitness trainer who has become one of the nation's most celebrated personalities in men's health and the fitness arena. His co-authored book, The Alpha Male Challenge, has revolutionized the men's fitness area. Rick has appeared in film, national television, and countless and online print publications, including the USA Today, ESPN.com, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. From the New York Law Journal to the popular Muscle Mag International to being a blogger for the crime section of the Huffington Post, Rick's opinion and wisdom is sought after. Rick is also a board member of the International Sports Hall of Fame. So welcome to the show, attorney, author, actor, activist, and adventurer, Mr. Rick Collins. Thank you for being on the show.
Well, thank you, John. That's quite a build-up. I hope I can live up to that. It sounded almost like an obituary, but thank you.
Well, it's amazing because, again, you wear so many different hats and different roles, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But tell us, how did you become interested in the whole law field? Because you're passionate about fitness. How did this all come about where you started to want to practice law?
So I was a mixed theater and psychology major when I was at college at Hofstra University, and I decided I was going to try to do something that interested me. I was thinking maybe about getting a PhD in psychology. At some point, I think I decided that I didn't want to listen to people's problems for the rest of my life, and I'd do something a little bit different. But of course, that's ultimately what lawyers wind up doing anyway. I was fortunate enough to get a free ride, a full scholarship to law school based on I had some good academics undergraduate, and so there I was, and I needed that because I wasn't a wealthy kid by any stretch of the imagination. I worked my way through college with 3 jobs. I was a nursing home orderly. I was a health club instructor, a personal trainer, and I was a barroom bouncer. That was back in the nightclub days. So between the 3 jobs, I worked my way through college, and so law school was an option for me. I think I always liked the idea of fighting for truth and justice. Maybe I'd read too many Superman comics when I was a kid, which I think is also how many of us get into bodybuilding, is sort of that kind of combination of muscularity and heroism that's attractive to a certain mindset of a young impressionable mind. And so I went into the prosecutor's office out of law school with the idea of fighting for truth and for justice, and sort of the acting background made me comfortable in a courtroom so that I have never been shy about, getting up and talking in front of people. And so that was just a great, I tell young law students, one of the very best things that you can do to be a trial lawyer, to be a good trial lawyer, is to start out in the district attorney's office prosecuting crimes. And I prosecuted everything from, low-level traffic violations to the most serious violent crimes and high-level drug crimes. And it's just a great training ground to be able to learn how to try a case, to judge a case for its worth. And I think you're a better defense lawyer for having been a prosecutor than if you started out as a defense lawyer.
Yeah, I love how you talk about the mixture of the theater background with law. I was big into theater for many, many years, but I also, for a while, wanted to dabble in the law, did the mock trials and the whole thing. And there is a big part of this whole, aspect of the courtroom that it really is a big theater, and the stakes are just really, really high on the roles you play. I love that you shared that. Now, how did you become interested as becoming a specialist in the legal issues involved with steroids and supplements and the bodybuilding industry? Because we start out with this whole career here and then it becomes very, very specialized. And how did that happen?
So I think sometimes life kind of finds the way for you to sort of travel in down a road, and it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you had any great foresight into planning. So I had two dual tracks. So on the one hand, I was very lucky academically to have good grades and ultimately proceeded down the road of being a trial lawyer, of training as a trial lawyer, of having the skill set to be able to handle myself in a courtroom, which came in sort of the law track. And then separate and apart, I was in a very different track in life, dating even back before I ever went to law school. And that was this fitness track. And so I got into fitness when I was in high school. I was very, very much self-identifying as a bodybuilder by the time I was 17 or 18. By the time I was 19 or 20, I was competing in bodybuilding contests. I entered a bunch of local contests, NPC shows at the time, and college shows, and have probably close to a dozen trophies collecting dust somewhere in the house from those days. And I loved it. And I tell everybody, being a competitive bodybuilder will make you better at whatever it is you do in life. And there's no doubt to me that I'm a better lawyer for having been a competitive bodybuilder. You learn the sorts of skills that make you better in entrepreneurial aspects, in anything. You learn about discipline, patience, overcoming obstacles. We all get injuries at some point in the gym or elsewhere, and it's a matter of training around them, bringing up weaknesses and making them your strengths. Sacrifice, which, everybody, when some of my friends in college were going out and partying, I knew if I had an early morning workout the next day that I needed to be more restrained. And so those sorts of values that bodybuilding, and particularly competitive bodybuilding, can instill in people are things that are just usable throughout your career, and I use them to this day. But I had never really thought about combining the idea of bodybuilding and law into sort of one melded practice. Nobody had ever really done it before, really thought of it before, and I certainly don't profess to have been smart enough to have come up with the idea. It sort of found me. And because I was a gym manager, I managed my gym during the day and the summer when I was off from school, and was a personal trainer. I knew and a competitive bodybuilder. I knew a lot of people in the fitness community. And they say that timing is everything. And it really is, because the year that I went into private practice, left the district attorney's office and went out on my own in a law firm with some partners, was the year that Congress decided that anabolic steroids should be lumped into the same act, into the same statute or law that covers heroin and cocaine and methamphetamine and, all of the traditional drugs of abuse. And so suddenly you had what was commonly used in the bodybuilding industry, by right or wrong, by many bodybuilders, particularly at the competitive level, suddenly they were in a classification that made them federal drug criminals. And so they didn't really understand what was going on with that. And the folks in the courts, the prosecutors, the judges, the cops, the defense lawyers, no one really understood what was going on in the gyms. And so I started having sort of a foot in both of the worlds of the gym culture and the legal world. I started getting more and more inquiries, calls, people who got in trouble wanted my help. And so my career kind of blossomed from there. I was able to begin to focus on health and fitness, and it expanded ultimately beyond just steroids. Certainly, I probably represented more individuals and entities on steroid-related charges than any other lawyer, certainly. And so if you're in that trade, if you're involved with steroids and you're caught or in some way caught up in a legal issue regarding that, I'm the guy who gets that call more often than not. If you're an athlete who's tested positive for an anabolic steroid or for some other performance-enhancing drug, a banned substance in sports, I do a lot of those cases. And it's broadened. So my practice now includes a lot of folks in the supplement industry. It started with sort of back in the day, there were sort of steroids that were kind of loopholed out of the Anabolic Steroid Control Act, typically called pro-hormones or steroid precursors, and they were in dietary supplements for a period of time. I wound up getting involved in defending some of those companies when they got jammed up, and that led to a practice where my firm represents bread and butter dietary supplement and sports nutrition brands on everything from contract issues to trademark issues to all of the issues that labeling, compliance with the FDA labeling and FTC claims. So we have a very active practice, and I'm just one part of a larger law firm. I've got 3 partners. We have associates and staff, and of counsel lawyers who handle bread and butter criminal defense throughout Long Island and New York, as well as car accident. We have a division that does personal injury work. But for me, individually as a practitioner, most of my clients are in the health and fitness space of one kind or another, whether they're bodybuilders or they're supplement company owners or they're competitive athletes, and they run into any kind of legal issue. I'm happy to help them. They can reach out to me. I'm easy to find. Just Google Rick Collins or follow me on social media. I have an active Instagram page and an account on Facebook and Twitter. And so I love what I do, John. I'm very, very blessed to be able to represent a body of people that I feel connected to, that are very often the people that I would be spotting in a gym are people that I represent as their defender, as their lawyer on different issues. And I couldn't be, I'm the happiest kid on the block.
Yeah, what do you think the motivation is behind the crackdown on steroids and PEDs and even things like androstenedione back in the day? What really is the motivation behind that? Because there are really 2 different groups of people. One is a very disciplined group of people that's trying to get their body into the most elite performance mode that it can, and the other is opposite ends of the spectrum. What do you think of the motivation was when these laws came about, and do you think that they'll ever be overturned?
So if you look at the history of that law, which came into effect in 1990, and a number of states were roughly before or after that date, but around that date where they took anabolic steroids and lumped them in with crack and cocaine and heroin and all of the more traditional drugs of abuse, including many narcotics. And the catalyst for that was the 1988 Seoul Olympics, where Ben Johnson, Canadian sprinter, beat the American Carl Lewis and then tested positive for Winstrol, an anabolic steroid. And the sports world went crazy. And Congress responded to concerns that there was this, blight on competitive sports, where if sports became a contest of chemistry and who's got the stronger drugs or the better drugs, that we would erode integrity in sports and ultimately public confidence in sports. And so Congress held a bunch of hearings in the late 1980s that culminated ultimately in the Anabolic Steroid Control Act being passed in 1990 and effective in 1991. There were a number of changes to that law. It's adapted over time as Congress has revisited it. But the main focus of it was the issue of drugs in competitive sport, cheating, so to speak, in competitive sports. And look, if the rules of a sport say that you can't take a particular thing, or if the rules say you can't wear red socks and you wear them and put white socks over them to hide it, even whether it's helping you or it's not helping you, it's a violation of the rules, right? So it's an ethical problem, and it's something that, you're not following the rules by. And so, but it was that sort of fear of the competitive sports issue combined with, Congress is always very concerned about saving the children. And so certainly, when high-profile athletes are seen to be using steroids, what effect does that have on the kids in middle school or in high school? And what sort of trickle down is there to that? And so that's also a concern. Whether the way Congress went about it by criminalizing solved those problems is a debate that's, I think, something that we can still have, because we're talking 1990, right? So certainly the law didn't get steroids out of sports. We've had plenty of sports. That was all pre-Lance Armstrong. That was all Balco. So many different scandals in sports through the years. So I don't think we effectively took care of that. And steroid use among kids actually increased in the years after the law was put into effect. And if you look at sort of the supply history on steroids, before the law went into effect, the predominant source of steroids were basically friendly doctors, friendly pharmacists who were backdooring out, diverting legitimate FDA-approved pharmaceuticals to the bodybuilding or strength community for them to use. After the law went into effect, that source kind of diminished because now they're controlled substances. The pharmaceutical industries diminished their production. But, anytime there's a demand and, people want something, there's going to be a supply one way or another. And so it was, for a while, it was Mexican drugs that were being smuggled across the border. Different permutations of European drugs. Now it's mostly raw powders imported from China as in kilos of raw powder and then made into injectable or oral steroids here in the United States in people's kitchens or basements. And so arguably a lot of the risks and any drug, we all know that any drug has side effects and some can be serious. And there's no doubt that using anabolic steroids without a prescription, without a medical need, without any supervision, without any monitoring is probably a bad idea to do under any circumstances. But it's much worse if the doctors have been driven out of the equation, the pharmaceutical industries and good manufacturing facilities are driven out, and the products are now coming from somebody's basement, from China through somebody's basement into your body. Probably didn't make things healthier or better in any way. And I think it's had a chilling effect on doctors knowing about anabolic steroids or treating patients who are on it or monitoring them on anabolic steroids. And so I think in many ways, it's an open question whether the Steroid Control Act helped to control the steroid black market or helped to make the steroid black market far worse than it ever was.
Wow, that's so interesting. I could talk about that all day. Can you share with us maybe some of the famous cases that you have been a part of?
So I was the lawyer who represented the chemist in the Balco case.
Wow.
For those of you who may not remember back then, there was a lab in the Bay Area that was catering to a lot of high-profile athletes, and connected to it were Jason Giambi and Barry Bonds and Marion Jones and many other Olympic and big sports professional athletes. And ultimately, there was a search warrant that was executed, and one of the items that was identified as a doping substance was something nobody had really ever seen before. So they want a particular doping sleuth by the name of Don Catlin reverse engineered it because they didn't know what it was. And they figured it out that it was a combination, a hybrid of two different steroids made into what was called THG, or tetrahydrogestrinone, that up until then was not something that was identifiable in standard drug testing analyses. And so therefore was sort of undetectable, right? I mean, it's like a fingerprint. A fingerprint is only good if you find a fingerprint and you can compare it to an existing fingerprint as a reference standard for it. So if you have no reference standard for the drug, you don't know what it is. So it was called the clear, and because it was transparent, you couldn't see it. And so that was identified, and I represented the chemist who actually a brilliant guy and actually a friend of mine to this day. And that does happen with a lot of my clients is because we kind of speak the same language and come from a lot of the same, gym culture, the same culture. We do wind up very often forging friendships. And so at any rate, the clear was probably my first big high profile case. I've represented numerous professional athletes on doping matters or steroid related issues. I represented the number one ranked middleweight boxer in the world at the time, Sam Solomon, an Australian, a former boxer who fought the German champion in Dusseldorf, Germany, a guy named Felix Sturm, beat him, and then tested positive for a stimulant, which I was able to identify had come from a dietary supplement that he took. He didn't willingly take it. He didn't knowingly take it. He didn't intentionally take it, but he tested positive. And, of course, it was disastrous because the Germans don't like to lose under any circumstances. And so they wanted, of course, to invalidate the fight. And also that, unfortunately, it would result in Sam's losing his ranking. And at the age that Sam was, that was a huge, huge problem because he had run out of runway to be able to climb up the boxing ladder again. And so I was able to defend that case and ultimately reinstate Sam's ranking so that he did fight Felix Sturm again, beat him again, this time fair and square, no drug issues at all. And then Sam went on to a $1 million purse in his next fight, which great guy. He actually flew me out to a future fight, and so I could see him fighting out on the West Coast. So I've represented some people with some serious stuff, other boxers, other people in different strength sports. I represented a very well-known defendant in a case up in Boston not too long ago who was a source of steroids, selling them over Instagram, and had a huge following over Instagram. And that was another kind of high publicity case. But I represent certainly people who are known and recognized, but most of my clients are not. Most of my clients are average gym bros, basically. They're the guys that you and I know, have been dealing with for many, many years. Maybe they get caught up in a steroid situation. Maybe they're using, maybe they're competing, maybe they're not. When you look at, and I was involved with some research a few years ago, John, where we looked at who's using steroids. Who are these people? Are they what the media tells us, which would be little teenage boys and professional billion-dollar athletes, right? And those represent a fraction of the pie chart of steroid users. The vast majority, 80% of steroid users don't compete in anything. Mm-hmm. They're not teenagers. They're not even, 20. They're typically guys, the average is maybe a 30-year-old who's never competed in sports, who's above average in terms of both income and education, and who's using it solely for, you could call it cosmetic purposes, you could call it aesthetic purposes, you could, knock it as calling it vanity, but it's basically people who want, mostly men, who want to look better without a shirt, who want to look better when they go on vacation in Cancun for spring break, or, to look better when the summer comes. And certainly we can talk about whether this society has become too vain and whether we're obsessed with appearance, and maybe we've gone too far in some ways, but on the other hand, in most other things, we tolerate it or we embrace it, right? I mean, so no one would ever think to criticize somebody for getting, liposuction, or for a woman who might choose to have breast augmentation surgery, or somebody who might correct some defect that they were embarrassed about, or somebody who gets orthodontic braces, or any of these things, or LASIK surgeries that they don't have to wear glasses. All of these things are things that we do for vanity. It's perfectly acceptable. It's in many ways embraced now. But it's that same motivation that motivates many of the people who are using anabolic steroids, but they're not lumped in with those other categories. Yeah. They're lumped in with the heroin addicts and the drug users. And I'm not sure that really was ever the intent of Congress. I don't know if they really thought about those implications, or if they really even think about them now.
Yeah, this is fascinating stuff. So evidently Balco was doing more than ZMA.
At that time, it was indeed, and I'm still friends with Victor Conti as the years have gone by, and but yes, back at that time there was a little more to the regimen.
But it was so cutting edge. I mean, you take that out of the equation, I still think they were pushing the limits of supplementation, which is something I want to talk about later, because I think we always need to be on the edge of what's working. And I think the masterminds, these guys at Balco, were really on the cutting edge of so much at the time. It's amazing. Let me talk about this. So you talk about this aspect of people struggling with this. They get a negative or a positive test. What mistakes or what do athletes do wrong when they are faced with a positive drug test? I mean, maybe it was from tainted supplements, or we'll talk all that in a minute, but what's the first thing that you think that they kind of do wrong in that process?
So, I come from the background as a criminal defense lawyer in the criminal justice system, and we're kind of used to the idea as Americans that you're innocent until proven guilty, right? So, from the day that those handcuffs go on you to ultimately the moment that a jury or a judge finds you guilty, either by your admission or at a trial, you're presumed innocent. And that presumption of innocence is very, very important, very powerful, and it's a shield, and it puts the burden on the other side. In doping cases, it's reversed. And athletes need to understand that if whatever they put into that vial, whatever is inside their specimen of urine, they're going to be accountable for it. And so it's what's called strict liability under the law. So there's, I didn't mean it, I didn't intend to, I didn't want to do it, is not typically a defense in those cases. So that if you take a supplement and it turns out to be tainted, even if you didn't know it, you're going to be accountable for that. In some cases, there'll be a reduced punishment, but there's punishment. So this sort of strict liability idea is something that makes you effectively, you don't get a trial in a doping case. You're labeled, they test your A sample. If that's positive, they test your B sample. If that's positive, and probably it's mixed from the same vial, it's mostly going to be the same result. If that happens, then you get an appeal. So you're behind the eight ball already, and now you've got to sort of fight your way back to establish there's a good explanation for it. And one of the things that athletes should do is be very, very careful about what it is that they're putting in their bodies. We've seen situations where even tainted meat has resulted in positive drug tests. Certainly, many supplements have. Years ago, I represented a client in a criminal matter that was prosecuted because he was a supplement owner, and in the middle of the night he was going into his facility and he was sprinkling clenbuterol, which is a beta-2 agonist and a stimulant that's used as a bronchodilator in some countries, not the United States, but it's a stimulant that helps burn fat, and some bodybuilders or other athletes will take it. He was sprinkling that into his fat-burning product to give it more effect, pixie dusting it, not really realizing that drug-tested athletes who take that product, that could ruin a career. And so it was determined, and he was ultimately prosecuted for that. So you're taking a risk when you take a supplement, and many of the anti-doping agencies, both at college level and Olympic level, tell the athletes all the time. They actually tell you, essentially, don't take supplements. And that's not necessarily good advice, because supplements can be very, very beneficial for competitive athletes. But if you do, there are some certifications for supplements, and you can actually take supplements that are certified to be free of banned substances. So the Banned Substance Control Group has one. There are others as well. So you can look for that. I also tell athletes, keep a sample of whatever it is that you're taking. Don't use the whole bottle up. If you're taking a protein powder, take it, but save a little bit, because maybe if in your next drug test you test positive and that's what you were taking, you'll be able to actually give it to me. I can send it to my lab and we'll test it, and maybe we can find that, it was contaminated. That isn't necessarily a get-out-of-jail-free card, but it can reduce punishments. In some cases, certainly the results can be far better if you can establish that you didn't intentionally, knowingly, willingly take a banned substance. And so if you're a college athlete, bring whatever it is that you're taking, whatever supplements you're going to take, bring it to your athletic director and get his approval or her approval on all of those things. I've represented college athletes who didn't do that, who wound up taking something that they shouldn't have taken. I've dealt with professional athletes who took some kind of a, male enhancement pill that they bought over the counter, not thinking, wow, maybe that could be contaminated, and it wound up being, destroying. A fight gets called off or things like that. So athletes who are drug tested need to be very careful. And it's not only athletes either. I've represented police officers, firefighters. Here in New York, the New York City Police Department has a no steroids policy. So they test. And the way that they test is not just for steroids. They do sort of an Olympic doping panel. And so I had a police officer a few years ago who tested positive also for clenbuterol, which apparently came from a dietary supplement that he was taking. And the police department didn't want to hear it. I had this circular conversation with a lawyer there who I said, well, what can we do to work this out? And, well, we have zero tolerance. Well, zero tolerance for what? For steroids. Okay, but this isn't a steroid. This is a bronchodilator. It doesn't matter. Why? Because we have zero tolerance. It was this just sort of circular conversation. They wanted to take his job and his pension away from him for a clenbuterol positive. I wound up spending a week in the New York City trial room on trial. I called experts from across the country. I cross-examined the architect of the Major League Baseball program, which the city called as a witness. Ultimately, I was able to get him acquitted. And so he was, there was no punishment to him at the end of the day, but it was a long knockdown, drag-out fight. And you want to avoid that. So if you're a police officer and you're drug tested, if you're on probation, anything like that, you definitely need to be very aware of what you're putting in your body.
Yeah, a couple of quick things on that. So, especially, let's say somebody's on probation that's listening to this show, even some of the supplements that have high levels of caffeine, can that ever test out as methamphetamine?
So there was a time where caffeine was actually banned in Olympic sports above a certain concentration. If I remember, the concentration was effectively maybe like four Starbucks, cups of coffee at intense coffees, and that's an interesting thing, right? Because caffeine itself, it's a stimulant. It may enhance performance in the short term, but yet, we accept that athletes maybe can't do it or can't use that much. That's something that we kind of accepted at the time, but that you or I, as non-athletes, as non-drug tested athletes or non-competitive athletes, should be able to have 20 cups of Starbucks. Maybe not the best idea, but we should be able to do it if we wanted. That there's a certain level of personal autonomy and individual liberty that should attach to what choices we make. We can go to a fast food restaurant and eat 4 meals a day until we hurt ourselves physically from that. So why can't we do that? But and that argument for some is made on the anabolic steroid and other drug issues, is that if you're a competitive athlete, okay, we can ban that. Maybe we should ban that in sports. But if you're a non-competitive athlete and you want to do it purely for your own personal reasons, why can't that be done through a doctor, through a knowledgeable, caring doctor, physician who will monitor you closely? But of course, we don't.
Yeah, it's just, to me, it's fascinating. And it seems like over the years, I'm a huge believer in supplements, and it seems like over the years, there has been a real attack on the supplement industry. What are some of the things that are being done to protect it? I know they're trying to get away from people who have proprietary blends or this or that, but it just seems like, it just always is under attack. And are there actions to kind of counteract that right now?
Well, it's interesting because the main law that protects dietary supplements was enacted in 1994. And it was unanimously voted on and approved by Congress. And the perception at the time was that the FDA was trying to really crack down on supplements in a way that wasn't fair and would deprive Americans from legitimate supplement choices. And so the 1994 law, which was the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, basically decided that dietary supplements, as defined under the law, and the definition is a vitamin, a mineral, an amino acid, there's parts of a botanical, that those things would be regulated as food, not as drugs. So they would be a subcategory of food with their own regulatory requirements, higher than food, but not as high as drugs. So that resulted, of course, in the media for many, many years saying the supplement industry is unregulated, which is a false statement, but I still read that, I'm sure you do now, it's still in mainstream media sources, they still often say that. And they say it because supplements are not regulated like drugs are. Okay, that's true. You don't have to do an $800 million pre-approval process to get FDA's approval. And the reason is that the concept behind that is that the dietary supplement ingredients are in our food. They're what we eat. We've been eating them for years and years, centuries, millennia. It's what we eat. And so they're inherently safe because we don't control how much of them we eat. And so that's sort of the history on how the supplement industry, has come around. There are those who believe that Big Pharma would love nothing more than to sort of get its hooks and make a tablet of vitamin C a prescription drug. So you got to go to your doctor and pay $8 for a pill. There are certainly those who believe that. Whether that's true or not, I don't know if there's any evidence one way or another that we could say. Certainly, it would be profitable if Big Pharma could get a hold of that. But I don't think that's ever going to happen. The sports nutrition category, I think, has always been one that pushes the limits a little bit. We talked about prohormones before. Some of those prohormones did not meet the definition of a dietary ingredient. They were made in a lab, similar to the THG that we talked about. You may remember, like one testosterone, for example, was something that was on the market for a while. It was made in a lab. It wasn't something in our food. And so we pushed the envelope on a number of things. There's been some litigation over certain stimulants and whether those are actually in geranium plants or not. And so the history of the supplement, particularly the sports nutrition category, has been to push the envelope a little bit. The big issue now in the supplement industry, which kind of comes around and ties into all the different things we've been talking about, is CBD, cannabidiol. Mm-hmm. So you can't walk into a health food store or even a mom and pop drugstore anywhere in the country and not see CBD products labeled as dietary supplements and available for sale. You can get them over the internet. You can get them in all these different places. FDA's position is that CBD is not a dietary supplement ingredient. It's unlawful to sell as a dietary supplement. And yet, open our eyes, it's everywhere we look. And so there's kind of a disconnect between FDA's position and FDA's real-world enforcement of that position, which seems to be limited to warning letters for companies mostly for companies that are making claims. If you make a claim that CBD is going to cure your cancer, FDA is going to send you a warning letter and say, no, that's a disease claim. You can't make that for a dietary supplement. That's only for drugs. But I think at this point, the genie's kind of out of the bottle. I think it would be extremely difficult for FDA to really rein it back, given the public enthusiasm for the ingredient, the size of the market now. But there are issues for drug testing with it because CBD is not legal in some sports. And even in the sports where CBD is legal, THC is not legal in most sports. And THC is part of the same plant that gives us CBD. It's part of the cannabis plant. THC is the part of the plant that in marijuana that gets people high. CBD doesn't have very much of that at all. It's supposed to have less than 0.03% to be labeled as hemp. But there are questions where in some cases a product may have too much THC, even though it's a CBD product. Devin Logan was an Olympic skier who tested positive not too long ago for THC from a CBD product and was able to show that this product, which supposedly only had trace amounts of THC, had enough for her to test positive. So that's another concern for athletes or, people on probation, cops, firefighters, anybody who's drug tested as part of employment, for example, to be taking a CBD product. We don't yet really have the information on how much of that CBD product, if you took it for breakfast, lunch, dinner, you took some CBD gummies through the day, suddenly at what point are you taking so much CBD that you test positive for THC? These are things that we don't really know yet, and that is in part why I think FDA is dragging its feet on setting up any kind of regulatory framework for CBD in the absence of more information on safety, on toxicity, on special populations, pregnant women, for example, children, teenagers, should there be age requirements. So CBD is one of the hottest issues. I get calls almost every week from people in the supplement industry who either have questions about their CBD brand or are interested in getting involved in CBD. That's sort of the biggest issue now with supplements, John.
Yeah, I know a lot of guys won't even come, like truck drivers specifically, guys that have to have drug tests. They are freaked out that somehow there's going to be this test positive with their CBD products. So a lot of them won't even use the hand creams because they're afraid they're going to test. I said, it's the whole risk. It's the risk to reward, aspect, we've been talking about. And, speaking of sports and bodybuilding specifically, can you give us any updates on the Mr. Olympia rape case? Is there any updates yet?
Right now the courts pretty much have been shut down, nationwide. Here where I am in New York, there's some virtual appearances happening. There's some very, very limited walk-ins. Here in New York, some of the court staff filed a lawsuit to prevent the plan to reopen the courts from moving forward because it's too complicated and they can't do the things that are being required. I actually did for the first time a sentence on a criminal matter, a felony federal case by Zoom last month.
Goodness.
We're entering like a brave new world of virtual existence, and how the courts are going to begin to deal with that. I don't think you'll ever be able to get a jury trial by Zoom in a way that would be fair to constitutional mandates. But anybody who's awaiting trial or awaiting resolution of their case, whether it's here or in Utah or anywhere else, the courts really, how do you put jurors in a box where they're shoulder to shoulder? How do you put a witness on the stand next to the judge? Courtrooms were not created with social distancing in mind. And so, and plus they have to be open. Part of the underpinning of our society is transparency in our court proceedings, so that, if there's a trial to take place, it has to be public. People need to be able to watch and see the administration of justice. The alternative would be these sort of secret proceedings, and what happened, who knows? That might be, some sort of totalitarian regime. So in order for us to really have a constitutionally valid trial, I think we've got to get, this COVID situation behind us. And when that's going to be, I don't know. Here in New York, there's some talk that there might not be jury trials until 2021 on matters. And so, for people who are at liberty, who are not detained, the most criminal defense lawyers will say that delay inures to the defense, because the bad act becomes, or alleged bad act becomes, more remote in time, and people have an opportunity as time passes to reinvent themselves, to change their ways, to reintegrate, to do something wonderful that you can then present to the judge later on down the pike. The further in the rearview mirror you can make whatever the allegation is, the better. But for people who are detained, for people who are actually sitting in a facility waiting for their day in court, it's a huge problem. There have been people who've been released because of concerns due to COVID, but certainly if somebody's innocent of the charges and is sitting in jail waiting for their day in court, this is a bad situation. I like to say, most people, luckily, most people who are accused of crimes, most of them are guilty. That's the reality. And I say this both as a former prosecutor and a criminal defense lawyer. And if you really think about it, that's the only reasonable reality, because if most people were guilty, if most people were not guilty, if most people were innocent, it was the other way around. Wow, you'd almost have to the system would be so broken, lots and lots and lots of innocent people being accused of crimes. Now, that doesn't mean that many, many, many people accused of crimes are guilty of the crime that they're actually charged with. Overcharging is a reality. Very often somebody may have committed a lower level crime, but it's been upgraded to something that's not fair. And the vast majority of cases in the criminal justice system, I think it's up to 96%, are resolved by negotiation. So it's implicit in those situations that the person is guilty, but maybe there's reasons for why they did what they did. If you really look at the criminal justice system, the number of people who are bad, just bad people, is fairly small. Most people, and certainly most of my clients, are good people who've made stupid choices, sometimes one bad choice. That one bad choice can bring you into the criminal justice system. That one choice when you decide, I've had 3 drinks, but maybe I'll get an Uber home, and then you have 4 and 5, and then it's like, who cares about that Uber? It's a short drive. And the next thing you know, you're pulled over at the side of the road, or you're God forbid, you're in an accident where somebody is hurt because you made that bad choice. So we see a lot of those in the criminal justice system, and a lot of what we do as lawyers is try to bring into the equation the humanity of the person, because we're more than the guy who makes that bad choice to get behind the wheel. It's a terrible choice, but he's more than that choice. There's 40 years before that of information, of identity of who he is, that needs to be brought out there too, so that sentencing is fair and is appropriate. And so a lot of what we do is that. Sometimes we do get innocent clients, and so when people ask the question, well, how do you represent these people? How do they represent guilty people? The reality is, as criminal defense lawyers, that's easy to do. I can advocate for the guilty person. And if there's questions in the proof, I'm going to fight it. If there's a possibility that the person, that the evidence is not sufficient and that I can poke holes in the prosecution's case, if they have weaknesses in their case, I'll exploit those in every way that I can, because that's the job of the criminal defense lawyer. But when you get an actually factually innocent client, somebody who really, truly, it's not that it was overcharged. It's not that, well, okay, it was a bar fight, but who threw the first punch? We could debate that. Maybe my guy thought he was going to throw the punch and he didn't, so maybe my guy threw the first punch and he shouldn't have. The actually factually innocent person, the person who wasn't there, the person who didn't do it, that's thankfully fairly rare in the criminal justice system, and I think every criminal defense lawyer would agree with that. And that when you get that case, there was no greater level of stress than from that case, because the system is kind of designed to funnel people from arrest to sentence. That's the way it kind of works, under the theory that most people are guilty. Yeah, you could, maybe he's overcharged, maybe he gets a misdemeanor, maybe he goes into a drug treatment program, maybe he does community service, maybe he gets anger management, and we can resolve all those things. But if you have an innocent client, none of those things apply. You've got to fight that case tooth and nail all the way to the end, and in a system that is designed to push back in every way against you trying to do that. It's almost like a salmon swimming upstream against the current. And I've had some of those cases. It's a high level, it's a high burden, it's a high level of stress, but it's also exhilarating, because there's nothing that feels better than getting justice for somebody who truly, truly did nothing wrong. And I represented actually a woman a few years ago who was accused of selling one vial of testosterone to an undercover snitch, basically somebody working off his own case. And she didn't do it. She was factually innocent. It never actually happened. He was able to make it appear as if she sent him, based on a tape recording, based on him actually hiding the vial on him when he went to meet with her, and the cop or agent who was supervising him not finding it in the initial search, so that when he comes back, he made it look like she gave it to him when she did not. Horrific case. Basically, she was a competitive bodybuilder, and I think he saw her as low-hanging fruit and figured, who's going to believe she's not selling steroids? She competes in bodybuilding. She's very muscular. She's got very low body fat. She looks like somebody who might be using steroids, and that's what a jury will think. So I'll be okay, and I'll work off my own case, because he himself was selling steroids. That was his problem. Wow. And probably had that vial from back his initial stash and tried to make it look like she had sold it. And I wound up having to fly out to a Western state and fighting this case as vigorously. And she would not take a plea for obvious reasons. She said, you know what? And she was facing 10 years in prison for that one vial. Madness. And I had a prosecutor who was willing to give her probation if she pled guilty. And her response was, I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do. I'm not taking anything. And I'm like, I'm with you. We'll fight this. And I was able to ultimately, on cross-examination, expose the snitch as the liar that he was, and to catch him in his lies. And luckily, our training as lawyers, as defense lawyers, we get pretty good at cross-examination. Prosecutors don't cross-examine very often, so they're not as skilled at it. But as defense lawyers, we get very good at it. And I was able to reveal that he was the liar that was setting up an absolutely innocent woman. And I remember when this all came out, the prosecutor's face was as white as a sheet because he had no idea that he had a lying witness. And he was like, would you take a misdemeanor? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to take a misdemeanor. I'm going to tell you how this is going to go. You're going to dismiss all of the charges against my client, and I'm going to try to convince her not to sue you, the police officer, and the city for what this travesty that she was subjected to was. And he was like, I could live with that. And so off we went. And she's still a friend of mine on social media today, and is just a terrific person, and didn't deserve what was done to her. So we have to be vigilant that, there's, while the system is designed to mostly catch the guilty, I would hope so, occasionally it makes the mistake. And we as defense lawyers and potentially as jurors down the road need to never forget that.
Wow, what a story. It has to be so rewarding, You
feel that nothing, there are a few feelings in life that are as good as that. I've had a few others similar to that, and it makes you so happy to do what we do.
Well, if you have time, just a couple more quick questions. I mean, this has just been a fascinating time. You did a lot of work in men's health, and the Rodale Press books. Anybody that read the Men's Health magazine knows about those books that you could subscribe to, that you had a great part in. What does the future hold that you see in the supplement industry, and I would say specifically in men's health? Where do you see things headed? I mean, I know there's peptides and things out there right now. We're on the cutting edge, with glucose dispersal supplements. There's a lot of stuff out there, but specifically in the men's health area, where do you see this heading? And just your advice, what's one thing that men that are listening today could do right now to improve their health?
So a couple of years ago, I guess it's close to 10 now, the very, very well-known fitness author by the name James Villapeg and myself co-wrote a book called Alpha Male Challenge, which was sort of a men's diet exercise book for guys 30 and over to reclaim that edge. Maybe they haven't been exercising. Maybe they haven't been following their diet properly. And so it was a combination of exercise routines, a 10-week training program, lots of sample meal plans, and also a lot about attitude. And one of the reasons that we wrote the book was the observation that testosterone levels have been declining generationally for a period of time. So effectively, we, the young folks in America today have a lower average testosterone level than their fathers did. And their fathers, on average, have a lower level than their fathers did. So the grandfathers, the fathers, the sons, we're working our way down. Nobody really knows, and there are many, many theories, John, on why that is. Everything from phthalates in our, different chemicals in our food, to, obesity and lack of exercise in some people on average. We're now, I think, close to, 2/3 or over 2/3 overweight in this country. About 40% or close to it obesity rate. So obviously testosterone levels are tied to obesity. But this sort of declining physical masculinity, physical maleness, testosterone decreasing is something that we wanted to sort of reclaim. And so the book kind of is dedicated to that idea. And even to some degree, on a cultural and social level, testosterone has gotten a bad rap in the last few years. We hear, toxic masculinity is sort of a metaphor for high testosterone levels. When we read about bad things that happen that a man does, it's often blamed on testosterone. It's much more complicated than that, and testosterone is not the boogeyman of everything. It's actually, there are studies that link it to many beneficial and positive attributes. So whatever we can do to raise testosterone levels is a good thing for men, and that would include, obviously, we don't get enough sleep. Getting more sleep is super important. Exercise, you can actually spike up your testosterone levels. They spike in response to exercise. So, getting regular exercise is so important, and particularly not just cardio, because marathon running isn't going to raise you. It's probably going to lower your testosterone levels at some point. But intense, high intensity training is definitely something that's a plus. There are testosterone boosters out there. John, I go with basics. I take zinc, I take creatine, I take whey protein. I have a lot of the basic staples, making sure that you get, just all of your B vitamins, C vitamins, so that you, your water soluble vitamins, and I do take vitamin D. So these are things you can do to, I think, improve your health as a man moving forward. And, I think age is just a number at this point. I've been training 40 years. I haven't competed in many, many years, but long after I was competing, I was still do. I train at Bev Francis Gym. So shout out to Bev Francis's gym. Hopefully it will open again soon, because here in New York,
yes,
our gym is closed. We are shut down. So if you go to my Instagram, for example, you'll see that I'm throwing around dumbbells in my basement, amid the boxes, trying to get workouts in where I can. And a lot of us here in New York, that's our option. Hopefully they'll open up again soon. And but pre-pandemic, I was training as heavy and hard as I can train. I wrote an article recently about challenging the concept of the term progressive resistance, as really being something that's in some ways counterproductive when you reach a certain age, because progressive resistance for most of us kind of implies some sort of linear increasing of weight. The resistance is often we think of purely as 40 pounds, 45 pounds, 50 pounds, that kind of thing. And I think a better term is progressive intensity, because increasing the intensity, and there are so many variables, as you know, to improve intensity, whether it's slower negatives, whether it's increasing the volume, and that's a lot of what I've been doing in my basement. Really, I don't have the poundage, so progressive resistance is out. The resistance is out the window. I'm limited in, I don't have a bar, etc. If I got a bench and I got some adjustable dumbbells, and so I've increased the volume. I've increased the training frequency. I'm hitting the body parts more often now than I would in the gym. And so with these sorts of doing higher reps, higher volumes, shorter rests, you can increase the intensity and not necessarily the resistance and get good results. And I think as we reach a certain age, we're probably better finding those other variables, or at least using them a little bit more, so it's not just the heavy resistance. I've never done powerlifting, and I've never competed in powerlifting, but I do like to train heavy. I had a 440 bench, a 440 raw bench at one time, and still can handle some good weight. But I'm starting to find that my joints thank me a little bit more when I find some of these other intensity variables and integrate them.
Awesome. I love that. Well, last question is kind of a two-parter. I want to know what's next for Rick Collins. I mean, what's your next adventure? We didn't even talk about all the adventures that you have been on. And is there anything else that you want to share? So what's next, and anything else that you'd like to share?
So in terms of what's next, we're kind of hampered by the pandemic. Realistically, I love traveling. I love adventure. I've done some very cool things. I'm a licensed skydiver. So, and I did that kind of as an outgrowth of the Alpha Male Challenge book, because I was getting a little queasy with heights at one time, and I said, what better way of taking that challenge and meeting it head on than by doing a skydive, and then I wound up doing a bunch more and getting licensed under the theory that we need to confront our fears. We need to conquer those fears. I've been talking for years about maybe doing a Mount Rainier expedition. I would love to do that, and I've got some crazy friends that I've done some things with. We climbed Pikes Peak, and we camped out in the Grand Canyon, and did all these other very, very cool things. So hopefully there's more of that in the future. The Olympia is scheduled now for December, and I'm hopeful that that's still going to happen. Dan Solomon, I'll give him a shout out. He's doing a heck of a good job trying to keep things moving under very adverse circumstances, with the whole pandemic. And so hopefully that will go. The Arnold is coming up, and that'll be in March. I hope, knock on wood, that we will have everything under control and we back open and functioning by March. You had mentioned I'm part of the Global Advisory Board of the International Sports Hall of Fame. Last year, we awarded a number of great people. I gave an award to Johnny Damon, which was fantastic, and because the Arnold Expo had been closed, and so it was basically just industry people this year at the Arnold, rather than a lot of other people. I got to hang out with Randy Couture, comparing our favorite movies. I mean, it was just a really cool thing. And Dr. Bob Goldman and Fairfax Hackley had every year, do an amazing job of putting that event together. So I give them a shout out, and I'm excited about that. I've got some cases coming up in different places, and John, I travel all over the country, and I try to make my fees affordable so that if you're in the community of strength training, of bodybuilding, of powerlifting, of supplements, if you're a fitness-oriented person and you have a legal problem, you can call me and I will put you in the right hands of whatever you need. And if it's my hands that you need to be in, I will make that work so that, I try to make my services affordable to everybody and to be able to help everybody that I can. In terms of anything else, I'll finish with, when we talk about International Sports Hall of Fame, there was a great story a few years ago that one of the speakers told, and it was a story about two twins, and one twin was negative about everything, and one twin was positive about everything. Two twins, completely different perspectives on life, and one year, the father, for Christmas, decides he's going to do a little experiment. And so he goes out and he buys a bunch of fantastic toys, and he takes them all and he fills the room of the negative twin with all these wonderful toys. And then he goes out and they're on a farm, and he goes out into the farm and he gets bushels and bushels of horse manure, and he fills the room of the positive twin with all of the horse manure. And then he sits and he waits. The twins come home. They go into their respective rooms. The father waits a little while. He comes and he opens the door of the negative twin. And the negative twin is there with an angry face. And he says, I don't like these toys. There are not enough of them. They're not big enough. They're not bright enough. They're not shiny enough. I don't like any of them. And so the father closes the door. He goes to the room of the positive twin. He opens it up, and there's the positive twin in his room. He's singing, and he's laughing, and he's dancing, and he's got a little plastic shovel, and he's actually shoveling the manure in his room. And the father thinks he must be insane. What is he doing? He goes, what are you doing? And the positive twin looks up at him with a big smile on his face, and he says, well, I figure with all the horse manure in here, there's got to be a pony down there somewhere. and that, I think, encapsulates what success is about and what happiness is about, is that, in life, we're going to be dealt some bad hands. 2020 for a lot of people is not the best year. If ever there was a year where your room is filled with manure, for many people, this is it. But, you have to focus on the positive. And, just as that twin took all of that manure and just kept hoping for the pony, you got to sort of weather that storm and never stop hoping for that pony.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank our guest today, Rick Collins, for investing in all of our listeners. If you listened today, you know it was a true investment in your life. Thanks, Rick, for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, John.
I also want to thank our sponsors, ZionMissionaryChurch.net and NeuroPowerSource.com. Our podcast producer, Drew Kiespert. Video director, Jolynn Thomas. Head of Talent Relations, Mr. Fairfax Hackley. Be sure to rate us and subscribe to the Pressing Limits podcast. Make sure to follow us on Instagram for all kinds of updates. And for more ways to watch and listen to this podcast, check out the Pressing Limits podcast website. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you'll want to check out Behind the Bits with Scott Curtis.